this is Miss Marsden and I'm going to be taking you through a lesson on ecosystems and communities. This is a new topic which is part of biology, so we're going to be talking all about food chains, interdependence and living things. So today's outcomes, we want to be able to identify examples of interdependence within an ecosystem, predict the impact of changes of one species on the rest of the community, and we're also going to be looking at extracting and interpreting information from graphs, tables and charts so that we can understand the relationships between organisms in a community better. Before we start, what I'd like you to do is turn off your phone. I'd like you to make sure you don't have any other tabs or distractions open on your computer. You need to have your booklet, which you can get from the Continuity of Learning area of the John Smeaton website, to hand, because it's got all the questions you need for today's lesson in there. To be able to answer the questions, you need to pause the video when you need to and give yourself enough time to answer them properly, please. You can always rewind this and listen to it again if you get stuck or you need to go over any information which I'm going to be explaining throughout. And please don't give up before we've even started. Please give it your best shot because this is going to be important going into next year. So your first task is, in your booklet, you've got something called a fluency test. The aim of a fluency test is to be able to help you develop your skills in understanding all the key terms you need to use when designing a scientific experiment. So please take note of the hypotheses, which is at the top, which will help you out with all of these answers. If you do get stuck, please have a look on BBC Bitesize by searching science required practicals to help you out. Please pause the video for as long as you need to complete it, but I would recommend spending about 10 minutes on completing a fluency test. If it takes you longer, please don't worry, this is the first time you're doing it, and that's absolutely fine. So, do now task for this lesson you will find in your booklet. You've got 5 questions which you should already know about food chains, photosynthesis and living things. So what I would like you to do is either in your booklet, if you have access to it, on a piece of paper or on a blank Word document, I'd like you to answer the 5 do now questions below. If there's anything you get stuck with, please feel free to use Bitesize or YouTube. Please pause the video for as long as you need to complete all the questions to the best of your ability. We are going to mark them on the next slide, so please don't worry if you are struggling. So, you need a different colour pen, and what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to mark and improve your answers, okay? I'm not going to go through all of them, so if you need to pause it to be able to improve these, that's absolutely fine. The only ones I want to focus on are number 3, which is the word equation for photosynthesis. So you've got carbon dioxide plus water, and that makes glucose and oxygen. It's just important to note that the reason that plants do that is to make glucose, which can then be used in respiration to make energy for the plant. A new term for you as well, number 4, is species. And a species is a group of organisms that are able to successfully reproduce. It would be better if here you could add an extra word, which is a similar group of organisms, because they all have to be genetically similar. And they're able to successfully reproduce. And what that means is their offspring, their children effectively, will be able to have offspring themselves. They will be fertile. Please make sure you've improved each of your answers. If you got any wrong, that's absolutely fine. That is the purpose of a do now. It's to help you understand what you know already and what you need to learn. So going on to new content, an ecosystem is all of the animals and plants within an area, so that we call that the community. But an ecosystem is the physical habitat as well. So talking about the rocks, the mud, the sand, the air, everything that is surrounding these living things that is not necessarily alive itself. So using the diagram, we can see that an individual, being a fish, makes up a population. So the population are all individuals within the same species. Remember the term species we talked about in the do now task? And the difference between a population and a community is a community takes into account all the different species within an area. You can notice that we've got the fish, a crab, grass, a bluefish, and a jellyfish as well. This takes into account both plants and animals within the community. Please remember that plants are living things. An ecosystem is different though, because remember, we take into account the physical habitat for the ecosystem. So we've got a rock there, and we've added the water as well, because they are non-living parts of the physical habitat. Please make sure you have written down the definitions for population, community, and ecosystem. Pause the video for as long as you need to make sure you've got those 3 definitions down. So we've got another example now. We used an example of an underwater ecosystem, and now we're going to move on to talking about a woodland ecosystem. So you notice we've got different levels within this ecosystem, where we've got lots of different examples of communities of living organisms. That does include the tree, insects, worms, for example, birds, squirrels. They are all examples of living things which are in the community. But when we're talking about the ecosystem here, we need to think about the fact that we've got soil. Soil is not a living thing, so that is the physical habitat, as is the air around the tree, as is the weather. So it'd be your job to recognise what is the ecosystem. It's a woodland ecosystem. You would have to identify the populations, so each species within there. So for example, the population of bees, the population of woodlouse. And you'd have to identify that a community is all the different species living together within that woodland ecosystem. So we've got another example, and that's the image on the right hand side. What I would like you to do, using the knowledge that you've gained so far, is I would like you to answer the 3 questions on the slides. So what I would like you to do is, in your booklet, answer the 3 questions. It doesn't have to be in full sentences, but you do need to add as much detail as possible from the diagram, because that is showing that you can interpret information that you have been given. So pause the video for as long as you need to answer the 3 questions. So, different coloured pen again. We've got an example of a woodland or a forest ecosystem. You could have had either. What makes up this community? So that's talking about all the different species of organisms within this area. So any that you have named are correct, but just make sure you've got a good list of examples, because again, that's showing you're interpreting the information that you have been given in lots of detail. The 3rd question is a bit of a stretch question in terms of how could you measure the population for each organism. So we've got 2 different measuring methods that we use in ecology, and they are quadrats. That's for things that don't move, so the grass, the flowers. And then we've got something called mark, release, recapture, which you could use for anything which is slow moving, like insects, or mainly just insects really. So we will come back to that later in the topic, so please don't worry. Just make sure you've got the names of those 2 sampling methods down. So now we know what a community is, we know what an ecosystem is. We can now move on to understanding what interdependence is. So, how are animals and plants dependent on each other within a community? What we mean by that is, how do each of the animals and plants rely on each other to survive? Because everything, even though they seem like they are separate within this ecosystem, they're not. They are dependent on each other to survive. So plants need nutrients from animal droppings, so their feces. That's how they survive. We talked about that in the Do Now test, that plants need minerals. That comes from the feces, the droppings of animals, as well as when the animals die and they're broken down. That's where the minerals come from. So that's one way that the plants are relying on the animals. Plants produce food by photosynthesis, and that food is for the animals. So animals rely on plants in that way. Animals also use plants as shelters to build nests. And animals return effectively that favour to the plants, because plants are reliant on some animals to pollinate them. So they're able to reproduce and produce more plants and pass on their genes. Animals then are reliant on other animals, because all animals aren't vegetarians. Animals eat other animals, so they are reliant on them to provide a source of food. So that demonstrates how all the organisms within an ecosystem rely on each other to be able to continue to survive. So we've got the same picture again, and what we need to think about is, what are the plants and animals in the picture dependent on each other for? So the deer are dependent on the grass for food, but in the long grass they can use that to hide from predators as well. The birds are dependent on the trees for nesting. That's where they nest. They also rely on trees for food, like seeds, and they can also use it to hide from predators as well. And like we said in the previous slide, the plants here are dependent on animal droppings and the decay of dead animals to get minerals from the soil. So that's applying the understanding we got from the last slide to our woodland scenario. So in terms of demonstrating this interdependence, we can use food chains, okay? Food chains you should be relatively familiar with. We have a producer, which is the grass at the start, and then it shows the flow of energy through to the top apex predator. Nothing eats the apex predator unless when it dies and it's decomposed. That is why we've added the mushrooms there, because mushrooms are an example of something which breaks down dead organisms. So when we're talking about a food chain, it's a little bit too simple, because it's rare that one thing only eats another thing. So what we need to do, we need to make it slightly more complicated, and we connect them up into something called a food web, which looks like this. So what I would like you to do in the food web is, I'd like you to name one example of a producer. That's usually a plant, but it has to get its energy from the sun. An apex predator is a top predator, remember? A primary consumer eats the producer, and a secondary consumer eats the primary consumer. So I'd like you to give an example of each one, please. Pause the video for as long as you need to. So when we talk about an ecosystem and the fact that all the organisms are interdependent on each other, we say a stable ecosystem or a stable community. It basically means that all the population, so the numbers of each organism, stays constant. If we change the number of one organism, it can have an impact on the numbers of all the rest of the organisms, because remember, they rely on each other to survive. These effects can be positive or negative, and what I would like you to do is, I'd like you to suggest what these may be. I'll give an example, and I'll say that the number of deer has increased. When the number of deer is increased, they need more food, so they eat more grass. That means there is less grass for the other organisms, such as the slugs, to eat. So the number of slugs will go down. That would be a negative effect. So I'd like you to pause the video, come up with your own example of what would happen if you removed a given organism. I would suggest you focus on the tree. So if we did chop the trees down, the number of birds would fall because they have nowhere to nest. They've lost their habitat and they need to find another. However, in terms of positive effects, the grass might grow better because it's no longer being shielded from the light by the tree. So they can do more photosynthesis and the grass would thrive. Another negative effect of cutting down the tree, you can notice that you've got fungus growing on the tree. So the number of fungus would go down. The wood mouse also lives on the tree, so the number of wood mouse would decrease as well. So we've gone through an example together. What I'd now like you to do is to apply your knowledge to the questions within the booklet. You're going to be talking about a marine ecosystem, but it's exactly the same concepts which you are going to be using. Just pause the video for as long as you need to answer the questions, and we're going to mark them on the next slide. So I'd like you to check your answers using a different coloured pen. The only ones I really want to focus on is number 3, because it's not just one point you need to be focusing on when you are talking about interdependence, because it is a complex concept. So the seaweed and the cytoplankton rely on animals for carbon dioxide, but fish rely on seaweed to lay their eggs on as well as a food source, for example. And you're just talking about how each organism is interdependent, not just one. So please pause the video for as long as you need to add any extra detail which you may have missed to improve your answers. Same thing for number 4. So it's given you a specific example and it said what happens if the penguin population decreases. So leopard seals would have fewer fish, so they'd have to eat more penguins. That would cause the penguins to decrease. So you're talking about the relationships of a number of organisms. You're not just focusing on the penguin. Same thing for 4B. And then the rest of the answers are relatively straightforward. Please mark them. Pause the video for as long as you need to improve your answers. So now we need to move on to our final skill, which is being able to read and interpret data we are given about ecosystems. So questions can have data in different forms. You can have a chart, a table, a graph. You always need to look carefully at the axes labels to make sure you have all the information you need. That is the skill that you should have been using all the way throughout Year 10 so far. So the question might be asking you one of several things. If you describe, you say what you see, and you need to use specific examples from your data. If you're explaining something, you're telling me why. So a describe is a what question, and explain is why is this happening. So you're going into more detail about what has caused it. So the last type of question you need to use is a suggest question, and that's you using your application of that knowledge to make an informed suggestion about what may have caused that pattern. So it's not just explaining it, it's applying your understanding of that situation to come up with your own explanation. So we've got an example using greenflies and ladybirds. So ladybirds are the predators which eat the greenfly, and the populations of greenfly and ladybirds change over a period of time. So if I'm describing what happened to the greenfly population over the 3-year period, that's my question. What I need to consider first is, what is it asking me? It's asking me to describe what happened. So that means describe the patterns very vaguely using specific labels from the axes. I'm only talking about the greenfly, so I don't need to look at the ladybirds at all. And I only need to look over a 3-year period. So What I was looking for is in the summer there is always more green flies, and in the winter there are less. Over the 3 years of greenfly populations, you may notice as well that overall the greenfly numbers have decreased. So you've seen a decrease in that trend. If you want to go back to double check this, you absolutely can. Just pause it, compare the answers to what is being asked of you, and that gives you a model for exactly what is expected of you in terms of describing a trend in a graph. So I'm going to try another one, and this graph shows the populations of rabbits living on a small island. So we've got 2 questions. The first one is to describe the changes in the population between 1950 and 1980. So the only bits I need to look at are from here to here. And then my second question is we've got a suggest question. So that's you coming up with your own idea as to why this has happened. So you're only looking at 1960 for this one. So you're looking at the point where the graph is the lowest number of rabbits. So pause the video for as long as you need to answer the 2 questions. So in terms of my description for the top bullet point, the rabbit population decreased rapidly. So I've included a specific keyword in there to describe exactly the pattern. It didn't just decrease, it went down really quickly between 1950 and 1960. And then notice, because I had numbers on my axes, I've given a specific number. So I've said it goes from 144 to 12. After 1960, the population started to increase steadily. It didn't go up as steeply as the decrease that we talked about earlier, but they returned to around 144. So I've said what I see using specific figures from the axes. Then I've got my suggest question, and I've said maybe the predator numbers were high, so for example foxes, and they had to eat more rabbits. That's what caused the decrease. You could have said there was more hunting of rabbits, there was more disease, there was a shortage of food for the rabbits, any would get you the mark. So what I'd like you to do now is I'd like you to apply what you've learned throughout this lesson to be able to answer the 6-mark question below. So it's asking you to describe an example of a stable community. So use any of the examples we've covered so far. Use a woodland, use the ocean, or a pond, for example. And then you need to tell me, why is it important that the communities are stable in terms of that concept of interdependence? So a stable community, remember, the number of organisms don't increase or decrease, they stay the same. So what you can say is what would happen if it's not stable. And then what you need to do is you need to include at least one plant and one animal that live in the community and how they interact with each other. So if you need to, go back, use the information from the spider diagram to tell me how do plants rely on animals and vice versa. So pause the video for as long as you need to. If you want to make a plan, that's fine as well. We're going to mark the 6-mark question on the next slide. So, like I said, you've stated an example of a stable community. For example, I'm going to use a meadow, but you could have had a river, a lake, a woodland, an ocean, etc. So my animal I've chosen is a dormouse. My plant I've chosen is a grass. And then in terms of describing the role of each organism in that community, the grass is the producer. So it's providing energy for the dormouse. The dormouse eats the producer, and that feeds on the grass. So in turn, other organisms along that food web, the secondary and tertiary consumers, will then feed on the mouse. That is how the mouse is playing a role in that community. And like I said, you need to say why it's important that the community is stable in terms of the concept of interdependence. So all those animals and all those plants are dependent upon each other to be able to survive. Anything that you missed, please add. If you don't feel confident, please choose one of the examples at the top, so either river or lake, to have a go at redrafting your answer using the model which you've now got on the PowerPoint. So this is an extension task. You do not have to do this unless you feel really confident and you really want to stretch yourself. So have a go at the exam question. The mark scheme will be in the folder in the continuity of learning area. Please pause it for as long as you need to, but this is the end of the lesson.